Strategic Planning for Capital and Debt. My name's Andy McKendry. I'm the CFO for Waterford Township, and I will be your moderator today. You'll be hearing a presentation from Craig Binning, but first I have a few housekeeping items. Please turn off your phones or put them on mute. Make sure you've scanned in at the door, and feel free to bring your ice cream in. I was supposed to say that afterwards is ice cream hour, but feel free to bring it in if you've already started early. Today we have Craig Binning. He directs Hemson Consulting's municipal finance practice. The Toronto-based firm specializes in providing planning and finance advice to a wide range of public sector clients in Ontario and increasingly across Canada. Craig has over 25 years of professional consulting experience and holds an MPhil degree in political economics from the University of Glasgow and a BA in economics from Queen's University. His particular areas of expertise include economic and financial impact modeling and analysis, user fee calculation, rate setting, local government policy, land use economics, asset management plans, and development charges. As an expert in land economics, Craig is also frequently called upon to provide evidence before the Ontario Municipal Board. In addition to his consulting practice, he is a lecturer at the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Ryerson University for the Municipal Finance for Planners course. Craig is also a member of the Association for Ontario Land Economics and Lambda Alpha International. Will you please join me in welcoming Mr. Craig Binning?
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. Some of you may be wondering what this Canadian boy is doing up front. Hopefully what I'm going to say to you rings true. It is fairly Canadian intensive because that's where most of my experience was. I think how it came about is I was at GFOA in Denver and was part of a panel there. And the discussions, one of your board members was there and enjoyed this talk that we gave. So I'm going to try to build off of that. I was able to arrive yesterday and attended one of the sessions yesterday and this morning's session on the budget planning, and as well listened to the mayors just before this session. And I think you're going to find that my session hopefully brings a lot of what was discussed in those sessions together into one place. And I'm going to acknowledge I've committed one of the cardinal sins of consulting. My slide deck is far too long. I apologize for that. I'm going to move through sections of it fairly quickly. Part of that is our Municipal Finance Officers Association in Ontario. Our annual conference was last week, and they actually gave me a 3-hour workshop to do this topic. So I've tried to cut it down a bit to cover off things. And I am going to talk in general about long-range financial planning, and I know the session is titled to dealing with capital and with debt. I don't think that you can talk about the overall long-range financial issues integrated in with the operating or current budgets without dealing effectively with the capital. So it's going to be pulled together in some sense. And I'm going to look at all of those revenues and talk about how we deal with it. I think GFOA has done a very good job at outlining what long-range financial planning and sustainability should be, and I've actually cribbed a number of the notes that they've done for the purposes of my presentation and for the purposes of my lecturing. Really, we're looking at long-range financial planning as identifying where those future challenges and opportunities are going to be, and with many of my municipal clients, it's one of both of those things often. And I've had, over the last 25 plus years, the privilege of working with a full range of municipalities from fewer to 10,000 to the municipalities of the largest in Canada, well over 1 million people. And all of these issues are the same, but on a different scale from one to the next. And really what we're trying to look at here is, what is financial sustainability? That, to me, should be the core of what we're trying to do. And it was interesting hearing the mayors just before here, because obviously you've got councils, just as we do throughout Canada, that are elected to give direction about how a municipality is to operate, how the services are to be provided, what services and at what levels they are to be provided. And I generally see it as our responsibility as municipal finance people to help engage council in terms of making the decisions about how to use that scarce resource of property tax dollars or other revenues that you're raising from your residents. And it really is looking at trying to come up with predictable and stable tax rates, other fees and charges, and your utility rates if they're applicable to yourselves. And once again, these are tools that I think we use to help engage council in making those discussions. I was a bit intrigued earlier yesterday when I was listening and sitting in on the rate setting strategy with the folks from the agencies, talking about the fact that many municipalities don't have financial policies, and the moderator of the session indicating that there's some real reasons why municipalities don't do that. I'm a big proponent of developing financial policies for a full range of things. I understand from that discussion that there are some potential weaknesses, but at the same time, I think they can be structured such that they provide more benefit than potential weaknesses. And so I often start with that and integrate it into the financial viability. So some question, well, how can long-range financial planning actually ensure the financial sustainability? What it ideally is doing is identifying where you're at today. Where are your strengths, where are your weaknesses, but then also delineating out what are the macro indicators over which you have very little control. The environmental or the macroeconomic environment, things that we as municipalities really can't control, but certainly heavily influence what goes on. But when it comes to the demographic changes, some of those we don't have control over, the aging of our communities, but we can with respect to how we designate land, how we encourage economic activity, how we deal with intensification and redevelopment can influence the way that our demographic profiles change and the growth that occurs. And also the assessment, the property assessments, and those challenges that we all experience around those. Ultimately, what long-range financial planning almost always does is identify the funding gaps. I've never worked with a municipality and gone in and they've given me all of their expenditures, we've forecasted all of their revenues, and they're equal. There's always a gap between what is desired to be delivered and between what can be ideally or affordably funded. And so what we're doing in that bottom bullet point is trying to create a mechanism that allows, first off staff and then through council, assistance in prioritizing the resource allocation and identifying where they can do things. One of the very first things I do when I sit down with a municipality is say, well, why is it that we're undertaking a plan? And I'm going to skip forward to a couple of slides. I usually start with this blank one at the very first meeting and say, well, these are some of the main reasons that I have experienced in terms of why municipalities actually undertake long-range financial planning. And then what we do is we start to fill in those boxes as we're working through. And this is an actual example from what I would call a medium-sized municipality, but experiencing significant amounts of growth, but also unique in that it had a combination of 3 urban centers and a large rural area that was servicing. Our governance structures are a little bit different in Ontario and in Canada than they are here in the US, but still these things are applicable. So one of the things driving it there was growth management. They had a significant amount of infrastructure that needed to be constructed and in place in order to allow development to proceed, and we were dealing with issues of knowing that debt was going to have to be issued to finance that. We typically use long-term debt instruments rather than bonds for the financing of infrastructure in Ontario and really in Canada. And then strategically as well, they wanted a census to the long-term perspective. They had a council not dissimilar to what I've heard today, where one of the members was the former CFO of the municipality, and that created a real pressure in terms of intensity of the review of documentation. Also transparency, this municipality wanted to ensure that they were reflecting to their residents how efficiently they were using the tax money and why tax rates and utility rates and other charges needed to increase. They weren't experiencing significant financial pressures, but that was certainly something that was on the scale, and we knew that it was going to be an increasing one moving forward, and I'll show you that hopefully at the back end of the presentation. And then external issues were not significant there. They did not have issues with respect to the ratings and such, but it is certainly something that we flagged to look forward to. The goals and the objectives of undertaking long-range financial planning is certainly to understand those current conditions, especially if there are any issues. And then how do we measure the financial or the fiscal health of the municipality and ensuring that we're setting up reasonable ways of tracking and identifying those. Assessing the changes of development pressures on the municipality and really start to do some decision-making around modeling and around policies and setting those financial targets that we can measure. We typically, when we move forward, recommend a sort of two-pronged approach to doing these kinds of studies. One is an actual physical document. a report. And that's the plan itself. And it's sort of set at a point in time and identifies where those strengths are, looks out over ideally 10 years, sometimes 15 or 20 years. And it is released to the public and inclines policies often, looks at where those pressure points are, and identifies mitigating measures. What is often behind all of that is what we refer to as a fiscal impact model. More often than not, it's an Excel-based kind of framework that in our particular case, we would develop individually for each municipality. We don't use sort of an off-the-shelf kind of framework. That is something that we typically think should stay internally, used for staff purposes, and informs the annual budgeting process. There's a little bit more detail on that on this slide, which I'm just going to pass right over. So the long-range financial planning framework itself is a tool that can be used, as I said, to help inform those decisions both internally with staff and then moving forward into the discussions with council. The final bullet point is an important one, and I think it was good this morning's session on the budgeting process, saying that these are living documents. Once you're going out beyond the one-year approval and into multi-year budgeting, obviously they're living documents that have to be reviewed and reflected upon as circumstances change. This gives you an overview of the way that we typically think about long-range financial planning and the different modules to it. It really is the framework of the Excel-based model, but it can be used to demonstrate the kinds of things that you need to do. Hopefully you can see it from the audience, and I know the slide deck is available as well. The top part is just saying, what are the base parameters? What are we starting with? Where is the municipality sitting today? What policies do they have? What is the framework? Moving down to the second row, what we're looking at is the demographics. Is the municipality growing? How is it growing? Is it adding just households, but is the population stagnant or growing? How is the demographics shifting, and what pressures does that put on the delivery of services? The other box is talking about some of the inputs like inflation rates, financing rates, and related financial assumptions. The middle is really where the core of it all happens, those blue boxes. And the center one is that operating and capital budget. And then on the outside, really what we're dealing with is identifying what your assessment growth is and how the revenue side of things is changing. Often the revenue elements are given a short shift in these kinds of analysis, and we find increasingly we need to spend more time ensuring that those assumptions are realistic moving forward. And then the big piece also, and I imagine that you as municipalities are experiencing the same way as we are in Canada, is the whole issue of asset management. Are we sufficiently putting money aside for the long-term repair and maintenance of our infrastructure? Huge pressure from our provincial governments, or like your state level governments, to ensure that municipalities are doing that, and increasingly putting conditions on awarding of grants to ensure that you've got an adequate asset management plan in place. What all of that does when it comes together gets us down to the bottom and says, based on our prevailing tax rate, based on where tax rates can go or will go, is there sufficient monies being generated to meet all of those expenditures? As I indicated, more often than not, there's gaps. And what we do through this modeling is then look at how do we mitigate and manage those. Sensitivity testing, looking at changing service levels, look at changing the timing of specific projects and alike. And then you'll see that I've got the policies down in that green box again, because I think it's worthwhile through this process reviewing and updating those. This is a set of parameters and studies that we often correlate to bring into the process. One of the big benefits of doing this kind of exercise is that you're probably already doing lots of long-range financial planning in different silos within the municipality. This process brings them all together under one roof, under one set of studies, and helps you identify where the overlaps are and where the critical points are going to be. So what are some of the things that we typically want to measure through long-range financial planning? Especially the top one is always what is the tax levy and what are the gaps going to be? If you're responsible for utility rates, then where are those rates going? The debt capacity or your debt utilization, and is it manageable moving forward? Reserve and reserve funds, how do they look today? How are they looking in 5 years, 10 years, and even 15 years? Even if your level of accuracy is diminished as we get out beyond years 5 or 6 or even 10, if you're issuing and relying upon debt, you want to see where that's looking cumulatively, and as debt moves away, if there's going to be opportunities to use more debt. Performance measures, how do you want to set out to measure things? And that's where the input from council obviously comes if they've got directions on that. And how do you stand up against other municipalities that are comparable? And hopefully the model can be structured to allow a whole host of things. I was quite interested yesterday listening from those from the rating agencies. For one very large municipality, what we refer to as a regional government in the Toronto area with a population of over 1 million persons, one of the things that they very much wanted was to look at all of the factors that the rating agencies gauge. And what we did is we set up a report card mechanism within the model that tracked about 10 different variables that the rating agencies told us they looked at. And moving forward in an annual basis and out over 10 and even 20 years, we gave an indication as to whether it was improving, a green light, whether it was staying about the same, a yellow light, and a red light if it was diminishing. And of course, we didn't know what the weighting was on them individually, but we could look at how they were doing individually and a sense of them collectively. And it was quite a powerful tool for them as they have a high rating right now and they want to continue and protect that. So just the study process. I'm going to skip through a few slides again. This is one where we try to illustrate who are the players and what are their responsibilities through a long-range financial planning process. If you're retaining consultants, then obviously they're going to be at the table working with you to develop the model likely. They're also going to hopefully be working with you on reviewing your policies, providing input from other jurisdictions and best practices across the country. And then importantly, the municipal staff, how do they work? They're critical to this process. I like bringing everybody together into one room from the various departments and at the beginning, and then working with the departments individually and then bringing them all back together again. If they are involved in that process, then they have a sense that there's a real benefit to them of providing useful and valuable input because they know if they do that, it's going to help them protect their programs and give them a solid basis for wanting to either increase expenditures or maintain their existing service levels. And then council and the senior management, clearly what we're trying to do there is recognize that at critical points you need to get council involved. That really varies from one municipality to the next. Sometimes we have a session with council right up at the front to tell them what we're doing. Other times we wait until the very end, and then frequently I get brought in during the annual budgeting process and do a 1 or 2 hour workshop with council on the long-range financial plan to show them how what they're doing today is going to influence things out over the longer planning horizons. I've covered off most of some of these next slides in that quick overview. Some of the things that we're doing is obviously looking at the reserves and the reserve funds, how those are changing and modeling over time. And I've got some slides in a minute that give you a couple of examples. As I indicated, one of the things that's very beneficial about doing long-range financial or fiscal planning is that it does bring a variety of things all together. If you're doing asset management planning, if you're doing master servicing plans for recreation, or you have the desire to place a new library, and these departments are doing things, once again, it brings them all together into one house, and you can start to understand the cumulative impacts of what's going on in a municipality. I was working with a smaller municipality in sort of a more central northern part of Ontario, and what brought me into the municipality at first is that they were having to place significant amounts of hard infrastructure, engineered infrastructure due to some short failings, and also to allow development to proceed. That resulted in having to increase some rates rather significantly. And while I was there, I also recognized that council had this laundry list of other softer things that they wanted to do, increasing the number of boardwalks, doing a number of streetscaping improvements, and I indicated to the CAO that they may have some financial difficulties given the scope of works that we're just undertaking on the engineering side. They then retained me to do this long-range planning exercise, and lo and behold, there was a significant gap about what they could do. And we had to then work with council and take that laundry list of activities, and through the modeling and through the long-range process, got them to establish their own priorities and got them to recognize that they were going to have to push off some of those non-essential things out over to longer planning horizons in order to maintain a fiscally sustainable municipality with tax rates that were acceptable to the community. Just to touch on some of the budgets and some of the documents that we use, most of these, some of this, there's a bit of Canadian language in here. Development charges study is an impost fee study or a lot levy kind of study, the way that we finance growth-related infrastructure. Most of these other things should be fairly applicable or understandable to yourselves, and we deal with all of those things, and they actually help us move towards establishing the long-range plan. Of course, with any kind of modeling, anything that you put in significantly influences the output. So data is key to this. We have to spend a lot of time collecting all of that. I hope I'm not scaring you all off, because I know that all of you have busy schedules already, and now is that better again? Good. So just to sort of move through to some of the other parameters here, these are the kinds of documents that we would normally rely upon. You probably have slightly different terminology that are there, but just stressing once again that you've got a lot of activities and things that you're doing right now that contribute into this. And so you're not always having to recreate things, it's rather just bringing them into one environment. One of the biggest parts, as I said, is when I started doing these kinds of modeling and exercises some 20, 25 years ago, we didn't spend as much time on the revenue sides, and I quickly realized that there were some shortfalls there. Often we were overstating the revenue expectations. How were the property assessments going to change over time, especially non-residential assessments? And it sounds like you deal with some of those same issues here. And the way in which people utilize services, especially as you start to increase the user fees and charges, ends up affecting the way that people influence and use them. Funding from other levels of government. We, over time in Canada, have seen diminished amounts of federal and provincial activity within the municipal sector, i.e. they stopped giving us money. Our unconditional grants, we used to get a lot of unconditional grants, just transfers over, especially for small and medium-sized municipalities to pay for roads. Those virtually disappeared about 20 years ago. Most of the funding we get now is stimulus funding through economic cycles, and it's getting more and more focused today. We get a share of gas tax money, municipalities now, which is something new and is the only source of sort of dedicated funding that's coming through. The other thing that's interesting in Canada is that we have far fewer revenue-raising tools municipally than you do. We cannot levy any form of income tax, sales taxes, or anything else, so that property taxes typically represents at a minimum 50% and often 75 and 80% of our revenues. And then just sort of moving into some of the key things is the capital. I typically think of capital in almost three different buckets. One, capital related to development. What are we needing to provide to meet if there's development pressures in the municipality? Then there's the issue about, well, if we want to increase service levels or change service levels, there's a capital associated with that. And sometimes it's the province or the state governments or federal governments telling us that we have to provide it at some higher minimum standard, which has a capital consequence. And then the third bucket, the one that's looming, is that state of good repair and asset management. And I'm just going to try to deal with a few of those things moving forward here. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the development forecast here. I just want to show you one snapshot out of a model, and this is the one that I referred to for that very large regional municipality. This is actually a software-based solution rather than an Excel-based, but gives you a sense in terms of the kinds of drivers that we have in here and the assessment that we have broken down by different types of residential dwelling units, non-residential uses, and then forecasting them, driving them, both the existing assessment base, how is it going to change over time, and new assessment that's coming on through new properties. And then the model, typically I do like to work with a minimum of 10 years. It sounds like maybe that would seem fairly significant to many of you. To be honest, it's usually years 1 through 3 are fairly good. 4 and 5 are getting a little bit foggier, and years 6 through 10, recognizing that there's a bit of crystal balling going on there, but at the same time, as I indicated, I think it's a good thing to go out at least 10 years, and we actually structure the models on 20 years to allow us to look out over longer planning horizons. We often don't share information beyond year 10, just because of the uncertainty around some of the assumptions. Some of the model drivers, and this is true even if you're doing a much more simplified kind of plan, even if you're not doing it into a detailed Excel kind of format, is you need to think about the fact that there's different things that drive our expenditures. I usually break them down into 3 different components. There's price or inflationary drivers that even if there was no other change in the way that you operated your municipality, costs are going to increase, and costs increase differently depending upon the service and the mix of services. One of the things that we're often doing in Canada now is coming up with a municipal price index rather than using the CPI, recognizing that municipalities are dominated by salaries, wages, and benefits, unlike the common pool of goods used to measure CPI. And then volume or demographic changes. And so as your community changes, even if it's not growing, but as it ages or changes, there's going to be different demands on different services. So with that higher level of government, one of the key things that they had to be responsible for were paramedic services or land ambulance, long-term care, and also childcare. And they had to look at the demographic profile and how that was changing to recognize where the needs and demands were going to be, both capital and operating, moving forward. And the final one is what we call induced drivers, or capital-induced operating impacts, recognizing that when you add a capital asset, there's the funding associated with that, but there's going to be a direct operating cost associated with it. So that if you're putting in place a new fire hall, or a new police headquarters, or opening a new library, you're going to need staff in those facilities, and you're going to have operating costs associated with it, and it really should be driven off of all of those. And you want to look at what the long-term impacts are. This just gives you a bit of a snapshot of, once again, out of the same kind of model about what those various drivers do. Hopefully this one helps illustrate a little bit about what we're doing. And I'm back to that municipality that I referenced earlier, a sort of medium-sized municipality, but experiencing some growth. And what we're trying to do here is show what the impacts are on the operating budget associated, one, with the emplacement of new capital facilities, and also the changing size and profile of the municipality. And the lower portion of the bar, this orange one, is what is that capital induced. So once you can see in the bubbles where it identifies something like that fire station opening up in the first year and having to put staff into it, there's an impact directly associated with that. And then the blue piece is really just the general changes that are occurring within the environment, some related to growth, some not related to growth, but not directly tied to any capital expenditure. And you can start to see the cumulative impacts of undertaking these kinds of programs going out over the 10-year planning horizon. So obviously the challenges that come forward, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with them, is that there's limited tax room available for municipalities. Revenues do not always grow with the economy in the same way, and it sounds like you've got some capping issues here as well that compound things. Capital replacement competing with increased operating expenditures. Funding in your capital works while saving for future capital replacement. And so I've got a lot of municipalities that are both growing and aging at the same time. So they're dealing with having to put in new capital infrastructure, whereas at the same time, facilities are reaching the end of their useful life and having to make decisions about whether to repair them, replace them, or just to walk away from them. Hard versus soft infrastructure, that playoff between what is necessarily required versus what we think are important to maintain healthy and balanced communities. And then here we've got provincial debt limits, internal and provincial debt limits. We have a rule in Ontario, and it's true actually, a very similar rule across the country, is that our provincial governments limit the amount of debt that a municipality is allowed to have, and it's expressed that the carrying cost of the debt can't be more than 25% of your own source revenues. Most municipalities that I work with have their own debt policy, which is much lower than that, often 10 or 15%. So it just means the annual budget, not more than 25% of those costs can be debt related, both principal and interest. And it would be the same if you're relying on some kind of bond issuance. I think those are good policies to have in place. What we've got here is how do you fund your long-term strategic budget? So once again, what we often do is we go through these processes of how do you do your planning today? And I've touched on a number of these things already. Some are doing multi-year budgets, some have Excel or software-based solutions to them. Others are relying upon independent master servicing studies or plans across different places, and then strategic plans as well. perhaps more interesting to today's discussion as well, once we've identified what those capital funding needs, what are the funding strategies that we can use? And so some municipalities like to use a dedicated tax rate. The City of Toronto, which is by far Canada's largest municipality, annual budget of $1.6 billion, and we're facing some significant transit infrastructure needs, and Council 2 cycles ago decided to, or 2 years ago, decided to implement a one-off tax rate that deals directly with the funding of future transit infrastructure needs. And we're moving into a municipal election year next year. We're on 4-year cycles, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out politically in this upcoming budget. And so we do that. User surcharges or fees for parks and recreation. I have one municipal client that within the recreation fees, they do a little bit of an add-on, and that add-on goes directly towards capital asset management replacement. It doesn't fund enough, but it provides a little bit more infrastructure funding. And then funds set aside for new assets are added or as required, so that as you're ending up with a bond issuance or you're dealing with something, you can use that tax room gap to help with asset replacement rather than just having it expire. Pay-as-you-go approaches obviously have consequences to them. And then the use of debt or long-term financing instruments, which is really a financing or funding strategy as opposed to a source of revenue. And so we just continue to work through with the municipality and looking at those. The states and federal grants, I'm obviously don't recommend that we rely upon those too significantly, but at the same time, if programs come available, then we apply to them. Developer contributions, both through internal infrastructure needs, but also ongoing impost or lot levy fees. Local improvement charges. I think you use some similar mechanisms. This is where there could be some area rating within a municipality, either through a special property tax rate or even through an annual contribution added onto the tax roll. And then the use of public-private partnerships. I recognize that those are usually restricted to larger municipalities and larger infrastructure needs. However, we have been fairly successful with medium-sized municipalities using those kind of P3 arrangements for the delivery of recreation complexes, and in particular our aquatica centers. So we can do some interesting things. Trying to move into some capital, I'm not sure how I'm doing. Okay. About 15 minutes left, so I'll try to get through this and maybe if you've got any questions, but some common findings. Capital costs. I think it's fair to say that virtually no municipality that I have worked with is fully meeting their calculated asset replacement contributions. There's some municipalities that within the utility sides maybe are very close to it, but on a corporate-wide side, there's some significant gaps. This is where I usually get hired by or asked by my municipal clients to deliver the hard messages to council. This is what I do much of my time. This graph can be a little bit scary, and I'll try to explain what it is. The blue bar on the left in each of those years, that is the calculated contribution level that should be set aside into reserves for the long-term repair and replacement of the group of all assets within this municipality. The red bar beside it is what they're actually putting aside or spending on capital asset renewal. And so you can see the gap there, and that doesn't even sort of fully capture the existing or prevailing gap in the municipality. What we try to do through these processes is move council to a point of being willing to increase tax rates or find revenue sources or redistribute revenue so that we can get to a point within a reasonable time frame, ideally 10 years, where the annual contributions or expenditures are equal to what the needs are in that given year. And so what I'm looking for is when the two bars become equal, which in this case is on or about 2031, 2032. So I had to go out over a longer planning horizon here. And what the green line shows us on the top is the cumulative impact or infrastructure gap. And what I'm trying to do is get to the point where the line starts to come down. And even though it's a long way out, it shows that we're making a movement towards that. This is perhaps a little bit better of an illustration of virtually the same thing, and that's that first municipality that I talked about in their actual circumstance. Here you can see that within 10 years we were able to get them there, but the gap is massive in the year one. And that's pretty common for most municipalities is when you look at the deficit and the gap, where we're at. I find this kind of information helpful to councils to get them to see what the reality is. Try to give them some sense that as overwhelming as it might seem, we can make small steps forward. It also helps in the public to show them why we're needing to do this. And as I said, increasingly what we're experiencing in Canada is both federal and provincial governments are requiring us to do asset management plan to qualify for any kinds of grants or subsidies. We have different practices. There's been a common one was a 1% solution. And what they were doing is dedicating a 1% tax rate to asset management. The nice thing about doing a percentage approach is that it actually grows over time as the assessment base increases. Some have been as high as 2, and some even more, and that certainly never closes the gap, but it's a nice dedicated revenue stream. I think it's fair to say that capital forecasts likely have more risk or vulnerability to them than the operating forecasts. The environment in which we work in, often costs change quite dramatically on the capital side and not as much on the operating side. We tend to have more predictability. Earlier this year, we completed a study for one municipality, and it included a couple of major road projects, and we used our best tendering information. They let the projects for tender, and the prices came in 50% more than what we had estimated just 3 months earlier. We actually had to go back to council and get them to adjust some rates for us. So this is where we try to tie together in the use of debt and reserve funds and identifying the capital impacts and the funding options. We often look at what the sources of the revenues are for the capital. You can see the external contributions. I've got the gas tax identified there just because it is a dedicated revenue stream for municipalities coming from, really from the provincial governments, but it's actually from the feds through the provinces. And then we deal with the reserves and the reserve funds. Sometimes I go in and a municipality may have upwards of 50 or 60 reserves and reserve funds. I tend to try to collapse or group them for the purposes of this analysis and often work towards sort of reducing the number and scope of those to make them more manageable. And then we just look at the final one is the use of debt. So when we don't have sufficient internal monies or we don't have sufficient capital being raised from current and we don't have the external money, then we look at the effective use of debt to help us manage some of those gaps. So just some of the key value of undertaking the long-range financial plan, and then hopefully I can answer any questions, is that it ties together various financial reports and policies into one comprehensive plan, identifies strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities for the long-term horizon, allows the ability to test the financial impact of key council and staff decisions, and then ideally the long-range model should be easily updatable to consider the evolving asset management data and funding priorities. So that's the end of my formal presentation, if there's some questions.
I'm not sure if this is on. Oh, here we go. I have one. I know, it's maybe a little different in Canada, but if you are a smaller town, maybe, you're streamlined staffing, do you, beyond, maybe there's no funds for a big study like this, do you have steps that we could take, being from a smaller municipality, that you could start to maybe get your own plan in place eventually?
Yes, I think that's a very good question. I mean, the one municipality I referenced where I was brought in to look at some of the capital needs is a fairly small municipality with limited consulting budgets available to them. And we created a much more stripped down version that they could deal with. But nonetheless, and when I was presenting an MFO last week, I indicated to them that hopefully some of the takeaways from this is you can begin to see putting the pieces together, and that schematic I showed of the different components of the model. That can be done on a fairly, if not a high-level basis. If you've got a reasonably straightforward groups of services, you can think about populating those boxes and then linking them together. And if you've got someone in the organization with a moderate level of expertise with Excel, they can probably piece it together. But even without that, it's just trying to get all of the things that you're doing already into one comprehensive sense and forecasting it out beyond just the one-year budget, the annual approved budget. These studies typically, I don't know if anyone was going to ask, but typically they run between $50,000 and $100,000. Those are Canadian dollars, so deeply discounted for the US. And once again, the fortunate thing is when I first started doing some of these models some 25 years ago, what I was finding is we would create them, staff would use them for a year, we might update them 1 year, and then they'd sit on the shelf. The positive thing about the way that we're doing them now is that we usually assist the municipality in doing the first year update because they get updated with the new budget. And now the models are being used, and some certainly have been used for over 10 years consecutively now, with the municipality doing all the annual updating without having to bring us in to do any additional assistance beyond year 2. The ice cream has made everyone sleepy, but...
Well, if you haven't had ice cream, it's almost time for the ice cream. I want to thank Mr. Binning very much for all the information. It was a wonderful presentation.